Welcome to the second episode of the Blazing a Trail podcast. This is a dedicated Salesforce podcast where I'm speaking to some inspirational individuals within the Salesforce ecosystem and talking about their journeys and how they've got to where they are now. I'm delighted for the second episode to be able to welcome Guy Farah-Fisher to the podcast. Guy's now working at PwC, but has gone on quite a journey through the Salesforce ecosystem and now actually working on sort of technology more broadly. He's received the coveted Certified Technical Architecture certification, which I know a lot of people strive for and are keen to hear about how individuals get that certification. Hence why I've invited Guy to join us on the pod. So welcome, Guy. Thanks very much for joining. Do you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I'm a director at PwC within the UK, and as you mentioned, more recently, kind of looking more broadly at kind of technology and technology strategy. So within PwC, I work as Chief of Staff to the Head of Technology, who's responsible for quite a broad remit within the business. So that's working with all the parts of the firm that work with our kind of clients to build and deploy technology to them, as well as the technology we use as a firm, as well as supporting the development growth of our technologists that we have within the firm as well as kind of working across PwC globally with other territories that we've got as well. So in my role, I have the benefit of supporting across all of those different areas. So again, it's super broad, super varied, really interesting kind of remit within that. And that can take me to working with, kind of marketing in terms of how we think about how we position PwC as a technology business and making sure that people are aware of the great technology work that we do across the firm, to supporting with, like some of those different areas around technologist careers and their pathways, as well as the technology that we use within the business. But that's kind of not my background, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But obviously a Salesforce Certified Technical Architect. So very much being on the technical side of that was kind of my bread and butter as well. But now, like I said, moved into focus a little bit more on our strategy as a firm and how we're kind of approaching technology.
Cool, and thanks for that, Guy. And yeah, as you said, we'll come into that a little bit later on in the pod, because I know a lot of people who go down that sort of architecture journey sort of talk about how they can get into sort of a CTO, head of technology role, traditionally maybe within a direct customer, but then also the opportunities that are potentially available, say outside of Salesforce and more broadly within technology in consulting firms such as PwC. So definitely something I'm keen to get into a little bit later on in the pod. But something that we'll start with, and I ask all my guests as sort of an icebreaker or an opener, if you like, sort of what was sort of your, I guess, first forays with sort of Salesforce at the beginning of your career?
It's interesting because I probably had a slightly different route to a lot of people into Salesforce. I kind of finished my A-levels and had a piece of coursework as part of my kind of computer science course, which was about building technology and building software. And without kind of knowing it, I built a super basic CRM, even though I didn't really know what CRM was at the time. I even kind of ironically used a bit of a Salesforce blue type color, but okay, that's a little bit later on. So I kind of left school and knew that I wanted to do something in that space. I wanted to basically be a developer, and I wanted to build software, but I didn't really understand how I could get into that, what that looked like, how did that actually work in kind of business. Luckily, through my sister, I was introduced to someone who was working in Salesforce. They were a Salesforce developer, and it was kind of maybe this is the right way to go, to understand how businesses actually kind of build applications, right, for an enterprise. So I just studied everything I could about Salesforce. This was pre-Trailhead. This was those old workbooks where you used to kind of step through how to build a workflow rule or how to create a new field, but just kind of consumed as much information as I could. I then ended up working with a startup who kind of, as an ISV, that basically built applications on the Salesforce platform. And they've kind of gone through a bit of an evolution in terms of some of their apps and their name as such, but they're kind of still around working and building applications on the Salesforce platform. So I kind of started working with them and got into it from there, basically. Got the bug, I guess, and could see how businesses actually could use it and how it fitted with what I wanted to do, and just learn as much as I could. Was reading, all around the clock, basically, to learn as much as I could about Salesforce.
Yeah. And would that sort of be your advice to anybody who's maybe sort of such as yourself, not come from that, say, traditionally technical background, and say maybe not done a degree in computer science or anything sort of such as that, just to go out there and consume as much info as you can, take in as much as you can, to then sort of give yourself the best chance of succeeding down that more technical route without necessarily having that traditional technical background?
Definitely. Salesforce has so much information out there. I mean, even back then, right, I was just reading Apex developer guides and just trying things out in different developer roles. And I think Salesforce is not unique in terms of technology that is available in that sense, but it definitely has a huge amount of content available. So I would advise anybody who's thinking about getting in Salesforce or thinking about getting more technical in Salesforce to just kind of consume as much as they can and try things out, right? Because it's not just about reading the theory of it, it's getting your hands on it and building, right? So, building with kind of Lightning components and Apex, and, back then it was Visual Force and so on. But actually kind of getting into it, I was, when I was kind of starting my career, I ended up setting up a bit of a business and working with a few micro kind of companies to build out kind of Salesforce solutions for them. So one example was a tattoo shop, and I built a Salesforce application basically to kind of manage their artists and their bookings and their calendars, and validating that deposits had been paid, and automating email addresses and things like that. So there was loads I was kind of trying to do, as well as reading all the material to actually get into the platform and broaden my understanding of it.
Yeah. And that's something that sort of, there's a lot of people, a lot of newbies sort of trying to make their way in sort of the Salesforce ecosystem and get that sort of first rung on the ladder. And I don't know, it sounds like obviously this was maybe a little bit of more advanced stage for you than maybe these individuals would be at. But something that I talk about is whether you can sort of volunteer for local businesses or non-profits and that kind of stuff, to be able to essentially give yourself more exposure and sort of play around with sort of a new org and that kind of stuff, and get some real life commercial experience if you can, even if it's not potentially paid, because obviously Trailhead's sort of great and there's so much that you can consume on that. But I think, from my understanding anyway, sort of actually getting your hands on sort of a live org is a bit of a different kettle of fish.
Definitely. And speaking to a real customer, a lot of Trailhead has fake businesses, right? And it kind of gives you that context. But when you get in and speak to someone, particularly in these situations where I'm speaking to the owner of the business, right? And in, as you said, of the few small businesses that I worked with, there was definitely one or two of them that weren't paid, where I was saying exactly that, like, I want to offer my services, I'm going to kind of learn from this experience, and as part of that, you're going to give me your time as a kind of customer, and together we'll create something that hopefully we can both be proud of and that you can drive a lot of benefits from. So I think getting into kind of client conversations, understanding a business, the way they work, particularly from the people that have set them up from scratch, right, is valuable experience that definitely helped me.
Yeah, cool, love that. And like we sort of touched upon there, you didn't go down that sort of traditional route of sort of a degree in computer science or coming from sort of a maybe cross training from a Java or a .NET background or something sort of such as that. When you were sort of looking around initially and in the first few years of your career, did you come across any sort of barriers from businesses because you hadn't sort of got that sort of degree or traditional technical background? And sort of, if so, how did you sort of counteract that?
Yeah, there was, I think, a couple of times when I was probably looking at my first few businesses, right, where there was some companies that completely ruled me out because I didn't have a degree. And I think that was a challenge until I built up a certain amount of experience, whereby I guess to them it compensated for not having a degree. I think for me, I just saw it that those weren't the organizations that were right for me at that point. If they had the expectation that the right people for them to deliver on the role that they needed had to have gone down a degree route, then I just knew that it wasn't the right fit. So there wasn't really a kind of way around it where I could end up working for those organizations at the time. But I just saw that they obviously didn't have the environment that best suited me, and I think benefited from a number of different places that didn't see that as a barrier to me working with them.
Yeah, and luckily now as well, it's becoming less of a barrier. I think there's still the odd business out there who've got those kind of archaic views, if you like, that you must have sort of X amount of experience and must have this degree and certificate and all that kind of stuff. But it's becoming sort of less and less prevalent, I think, which is good for sure, and allows sort of people to come from more sort of creative or unusual backgrounds, which I think is good. And also as well for somebody such as yourself, you've had completely different experiences from other individuals. So sort of building up that sort of diverse workforce and diversity of thought from somebody such as yourself with your sort of experiences versus somebody who has gone to university and gone down the traditional sort of route is good to have that sort of mixture and balance, I think.
Yeah, and I think in technology as a whole, and probably particularly Salesforce, you've obviously got certifications, right, that people tend to use to understand somebody's knowledge of an area. Obviously, it doesn't always work out exactly like that, but it can be used to help gauge someone's experience. So that probably helped as I got further in my career, as I kind of built up the number of certifications that I then had, that people could see that I was learning and continually trying to broaden my understanding of the Salesforce platform. And I think it's a really good point around kind of diversity of thought and the diversity of the people that you've got. So we obviously have a lot of emphasis, within PwC around how we make sure that we build up diverse teams from different backgrounds, different, ethnicities, different experiences, gender, of course, and loads of other different aspects of what makes people diverse. Diversity of thought, I think, is really important when we kind of carve out those teams and ensure that we've got different perspectives based on people's different experiences. And having not been to university and studied a lot myself, done those different kind of certifications, I probably had a different experience than a lot of people that I then went on to work with.
Yeah, for sure. And you've segued us nicely into sort of the certifications piece. Sort of, I guess, when did you sort of first start to, I guess, sort of learn about sort of the certifications as a whole, and then sort of the Golden Globe, if you like, and that sort of CTA certification?
As soon as I think got into working in Salesforce, I was introduced to the certifications and the coveted kind of CTA. But it was so interesting because now I kind of think back to how I thought about, what the CTA was and the people that had passed it. And it was very much held in high esteem. And it was this, pathway that was, treacherous and would be really difficult to get to. And I was just focusing on, doing the net certification. How can I do the developer cert, the admin cert, sales cloud consultant, and so on. And I think it was only that I got kind of further and further, a few years into my career, that I then saw that the CTA was something that was achievable for me. I think I'd started working with CTAs, and I think every CTA that I've ever worked with is always willing to offer kind of guidance, support, advice on what that journey looked like for them, and what it could look like for you, and kind of work that through. So when I first heard about it, it was wow, this is an amazing concept that only the few could achieve, and the process is, you know, really difficult to kind of get to. And then as I understood more and more about it, I could see that it was something that was possible. But as soon as I heard about it, I knew I had to do it. It was, you know, top of the pyramid, right, on all these kind of diagrams. There was no point in my career where I'd not known that I was going to go down that path, because if there was a certification at the top of the tree, in my mind, I needed to kind of achieve that.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like sort of a lot of other people have that kind of view as well, and like you said, see it as sort of the cherry on top, and it's something they must attain. Obviously, sort of in that early part of your career, you were sort of accumulating knowledge that would help you sort of secure that certification further down the line. But what was sort of the trigger point for you to then sort of officially sort of commence the actual CTA sort of certification or sort of pathway or journey?
It was probably when I finished the system architect and application architect exams. So I'd kind of, that was my main focus, right? I'm going to do all the prerequisites. Once I finish those, then I can just focus on the CTA itself. But wasn't getting too caught up in what that actually looked like, and how I would kind of go about it, and what my own journey was, until I finished those certifications. And they're a core part of just understanding architecture more generally, right? So if you think about the system architect, obviously getting a better understanding of integration, single sign-on, and so on. I knew that they were going to be key components, so it was well, I'm working towards that, and this is kind of the first step within that process.
Yeah, and I got you. And then sort of once you'd achieved those, what was then sort of the journey over the next, I mean, you told me sort of year, 18 months, 2 years to then sort of officially sort of going for the review board?
I'm trying to think how long it was. It was probably a few years from finishing those prerequisites to then sitting the review board. At the time, so I was at Acumen Solutions, which is obviously now kind of part of Salesforce Professional Services. When I finished those prerequisites, and they had you know, a good program for supporting people through the CTA process, that I'm sure has kind of naturally slotted into Salesforce as a whole. So I got the support to basically understand what my, you know, journey would look like. I didn't then go on to take it until I joined PwC after that point as well. But that was, you know, focusing then on what is it that is part of the CTA that maybe hasn't been part of the prerequisites, or what real life experience can I gain to strengthen some of those different areas. Where can I work on a project that involves more integration or single sign-on, or has huge data volume considerations, because I know that those are going to be things that come up in the CTA panel as well. And just a better understanding of what that exam was, how a scenario is presented, how that you go through that kind of preparation process, and then, you know, how you kind of go about presenting to a panel. And interestingly, I think one thing that I've learned is that everyone's journey is different. Everyone's approach to the CTA board scenario is different. I think I probably had my own experience. Others would have approached it all very differently.
Yeah. And you touched upon, obviously, that you're quite fortunate to work alongside sort of other CTAs in your sort of lead up or run up to that, which was obviously massively advantageous. What other resources did you sort of tap into that were sort of equally helpful?
I think I found what worked for me. I mean, I feel like I'm a professional Googler. Like I've built a career of like teaching myself through Google. and the CTA process was no exception. So yeah, there was people around that could support with how to think about some of the bigger questions when approaching, an architecture and a big business problem. But where I had gaps in my knowledge, or I wanted to make sure that I was super clear on how I'd approach a particular challenge, I was kind of Googling as much as I could for the documentation or examples where people have done that. And there's so much, blog type content out there in the community that people are always looking to share their experiences as well.
Yeah. You've given some great advice and tips already, but what would sort of, whether it be, say, somebody who's sort of just learning about Salesforce and sees that sort of pyramid and it's like, right, in 10 years I want to become a CTA, or somebody who's just completed the sort of system and application architecture certifications and things, like, right, the CTA is now the next natural step. What sort of advice or key points would you give to either of those sort of individuals as to get to the point that you're at now?
Sure. I think my first piece of advice would be to not just focus on understanding the theory and reading all that documentation. As much as that's a component of it, you need to know the platform, you need to understand all the different patterns and architectural approaches that you can read about. Nothing can replace hands-on experience. And I don't just mean kind of building it as a developer, but I mean as an architect, working with challenging business problems and solving those, and thinking more broadly about the solution, the business impact, the maintenance, the governance models, all the different parts of the CTA process that you can't just read about. I was, again, fortunate that I kind of worked in consulting when I was going through that process. So for me, it was tackling different client problems and solving those in different ways based on various different constraints that we had, right? And I do think that that's probably the best experience that you can get when going through the CTA process, is different clients in different industries with different problems, integrating with different systems, because again, that's what the CTA scenario is going to be like. You're not going to know what the industry is. You're not going to know the problem the client has. You're not going to know the existing systems that they're going to be talking about as well. Yeah.
Was there sort of any kind of moment for you sort of during the process or at that review board that sort of something came up that had happened sort of super early in your career, or that you'd sort of come across sort of previous, and you're like, oh, I'm so glad that I've kind of done that, or sort of I've researched this or that? Was there that kind of light bulb moment at all in that process?
Yeah, there's probably a few things that crop up, and you're glad that 4 years previously you worked on a project or worked with a particular client. One for me that I always think about was identity and identity management more broadly. I was working with a client on a project that we had, and we also then started working on a project to kind of implement Salesforce as an identity provider. And I knew that it was an area that I had much experience in. So I was, jumping basically to kind of work on that project and work across both the projects that we had with the client. And I basically said to the team, I'll do 2 jobs. If that's what it means for me to kind of complete both of these projects, I'll just, do double the hours and do 2 roles. And I think off the back of that, I had a really good understanding of single sign-on, Salesforce as a kind of identity provider or service provider, and everything that is wrapped up within that as well. And that was always going to come up within the CTA process. So I think I often think about the fact that originally they told me that it didn't make sense. We didn't want to kind of have challenges with the project that I was already working on, but I knew that it was going to be a really interesting experience, and I was going to just put as much effort into it as needed. And they were both successful, and learned a lot through that process.
Yeah. And I mean, look, in any sort of walk of life, you've indirectly hit on another thing there that can't be, I guess, underestimated is that work ethic piece there, and the fact that you were sort of offering to do two jobs at once to get that exposure and experience demonstrates sort of your desire to get that certification and sort of beyond that as well to get to where you are now as well.
I think I was interested in it as well. Like, I was passionate about what I was doing, and I really enjoyed seeing the business problem and working out how we could solve for that, and kind of getting into the weeds and seeing the various different snakes amongst them as you went through that process, because I knew that those were going to be the scars that I was going to refer to when I was in that CTA process and just further along in my career, right? Like, it's obviously not just about preparing for the CTA. That was kind of a goal for me, but it was also more broadly about how to kind of set myself up with the right experience as I continued in my career.
Yeah. But potentially not, because obviously you got that certification, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, got it sort of first time around, so you did sort of quite a lot right. But was there anything at all you'd sort of do differently if you had your time again?
Yeah, you're right. I was fortunate enough to to kind of pass it first time round. It's going back a few years now. I don't think I would have done anything differently. I think I would have gone back and kind of reassured myself that I was on the right path and to be patient with it. There was probably points where I was frustrated that I wanted to move, more quickly through the process, because I was adamant that I needed to do it as soon as I could. I don't think I could have done it any faster, really, but I think I would have probably reassured myself that it was coming. I was on the right path, and I was kind of doing the right things, and I didn't need to kind of stress about it in the way that I did. But ultimately, there was points where I was doing 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, because I was like, this is what I need to do, and this is what it's going to take for me to get there. Yeah.
And obviously appreciate again that you're sort of doing a slightly different role now, but potentially even now, but sort of at the time, once you sort of passed or were going through that journey, did you feel like the offering that you were able to give to sort of your customers and clients, because of the knowledge that you'd accumulated through sort of the process, that essentially the service you were able to offer was sort of a lot more rounded than potentially sort of earlier on in your career before you started that journey?
Definitely. Significantly more well-rounded, I think, is the good way to put it, because the way that you have to think about problems within the CTA process is a bigger picture, right? You're obviously going to get into the detail of the Salesforce component to the solution, but there's an element of having to talk about some of the other technologies that will be involved, and whether it's getting into some of the details of kind of integration, or the role that you could play with a data warehouse, for example, and how to deliver with such large volumes or a tricky requirement. I think through that process, I definitely broadened out my understanding and the practice of just doing it over and over again, right? And presenting to a panel of judges, whether it was in the actual CTA board itself, or kind of prior to that, was great experience for me to learn how to step through that process. And I focused a lot on my communication with telling that story. And again, I think everyone's got their own approach to the CTA board and their own solution. For me, I emphasized a lot on how I told that story. So once I'd created the solution, it was about tying it back to that business challenge. How do I articulate, the overarching problem and overarching context that this all sits within? What's the backdrop, and how do I make that relevant to the solution as I then continue to talk about the technical detail that I'm going to go into? I wanted to focus not on each individual requirement and talking about how I would deliver that, but how does this end-to-end sales process, for example, work? how do I talk about the data lifecycle, the various different integration points and automation steps within that fits together in a cohesive way that I can then tie back to the overall context.
Yeah, and then what impact that has on them as a business, right? Because I see it so often now when I'm talking to customers, and it's like, yeah, we've got this product, and they're not actually using any of them, and it's not overly sort of relevant to them. So it's super important that those solutions that you're architecting are actually going to have real business impact to your customers, right?
Yeah, for sure. And in the CTA process, unlimited budget, unlimited timeline, you're not constrained by some of the things that you're traditionally constrained with. So it's easy to get in and throw in every product under the sun, or talk about approaches that maybe aren't optimal because there's no time constraint, or you don't need to worry about how you're going to actually manage that solution. But I think that the judges do a good job of making sure that you're tying it back to, as you said, the business and what value they're actually going to drive for it. Does that make sense for them at this moment? Does that make sense for them as we think about the maintenance of the solution going forward? And again, there's the experience that you get from just doing that with customers, right? Like there's a lot of times where you can, in theory, add in additional product or an additional technology, but those trade-offs around when it makes sense to do that is something that you can also learn when you're doing it, when you're interacting with clients, because there are the constraints that you would not have within the CTA scenario.
Yeah, for sure. So you've got that certification. Obviously, that was a few years back now. That's sort of the holy grail, if you like. Sort of, was there sort of then a moment of like, right, I've sort of achieved it all. Like, what do I do now?
Definitely. When you've worked towards one goal for years, and you kind of achieved that, there was a moment of, kind of relaxing and understanding that I'd met what I'd been trying to achieve for so long. But I think there was definitely a moment where I thought, okay, well, what do I kind of work towards now? Is it about understanding more about technology as a whole? Am I kind of broadening my understanding? I think that's where I started to go to make sure that I wasn't a Salesforce architect, and more broadly talk about a lot of the adjacent technologies and types of systems that would be relevant to customers. And again, I was working for a consultant. I was at PwC and working with clients, so my understanding had been broadening as I was going through the CTA process anyway. But part of it afterwards was certainly about how I can talk about the industry-specific technologies that would be relevant for my clients, or how Salesforce can, and when it shouldn't, be used to solve particular problems alongside other technologies. So my understanding kind of broadened out massively after that point, because I'd kind of ticked that box, right, in terms of how to deliver a Salesforce solution. So it was about broadening my technology and architectural understanding, and thinking just more generally around how to approach these kind of problems that I was facing with clients. Yeah.
And how's that now sort of translated into sort of what you're doing now as sort of part of, like you said, a broader role across sort of technology?
It meant that I got more exposure to thinking around kind of operating models or governance, as well as different patterns and principles that you want to kind of leverage when you're thinking about kind of technology for a client, but also kind of how to deliver technology. And not only do we think about the technology that we use as a firm, but how do we make sure that we're delivering the best solutions for our clients? So thinking about what are those models for delivering technology, and where does it make sense to simplify solutions? Where does it make sense to bring in other technologies? I think was part of that kind of learning experience for me, and some of that I use today. I then have this whole other area which is around the strategy of again what we're kind of doing as a firm, and working with the different parts of the business who work across a number of different technologies, right? Salesforce is a kind of small component of the technology capabilities that the PwC's got in the UK. So understanding where things are the right approach for different technologies as well, I think is something that I've managed to kind of pick up and leverage as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I've not prepared you for this question, and this is a completely left field question, but one that I'm getting kind of asked a lot, and interested to see if it's impacting you at all. Obviously, so there has been a bit of a downturn in sort of the market and the economy generally, and sort of through speaking to other businesses, there may be sort of finding a bit of a challenge to sort of sign new logos or new clients, whatever it may well be. What are you, obviously I appreciate that you've been doing a lot of work on maybe internal kind of strategy, but is there sort of what kind of things are you hearing from your sort of customers and clients about sort of the state of sort of their businesses, and sort of how sort of not how much they intend to use you sort of this year, but sort of their sort of confidence, I guess, and how sort of they're likely to perform versus maybe last year or the last 18 months or so?
Sure. It's a tricky one, and it's really interesting because it's probably a different answer in different industries as well. But broadly, the summary I think that we've seen is that businesses are still understanding that they need to transform. PwC has a CEO survey, and there's a couple of interesting stats in there, one of which is around CEOs and their belief in their business model and how kind of viable it is for the next 10 years. And the number of them that are thinking about how they have to completely transform the way that they operate is quite staggering. And I think they understand that they need help in that process. So there's probably areas that we're seeing across a number of different industries where businesses are being a little bit more cautious, as you said, where there's been slowdown on their side, and they're thinking about how to really approach it. Where do they make sure that they invest, and cutting some of the projects that they were maybe thinking about. But it's front of mind that this transformation that has been happening needs to continue to happen, because the way that they operate today can't be how they operate in 10 years. And in order to prepare for that world, they need to be thinking differently about what they're doing. And a huge component of that transformation is going to come from technology. It's something like 85% of CEOs reported in the survey that they were investing in automation. And we think about some of those key themes, so automation, AI, data analytics, that we know that businesses are continuing to think about and are continuing to have at the forefront of their mind. They know that they need to do things differently, and they're going to be trying to kind of automate the processes as much as they can. And that might involve some investment upfront now to kind of gain the ROI over time. But they also know that there's trends like ChatGPT that's coming out, and the AI is going to be a big part of the way that they need to operate and think about things. And again, that they need support in how to kind of get the best out of that and drive real benefits. And I think what we've seen is that businesses are continued to need that support, like I said, around transformation as a whole, but they're just focusing in a few key areas for them.
Yeah. And has that affected you personally at all, in terms of the feedback that you're getting from say those CEOs, to be like, right, I need to be sort of super clued up around sort of AI analytics, that kind of stuff, or potentially other areas that sort of customers are consistently talking about in terms of where they sort of see themselves investing in sort of the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years?
Yeah, those three areas I'd say are key and front of mind, right? And part of it is, how do we make sure that we're offering the right guidance and advice to our clients to understand exactly how we can support, right, in those transformations, where we think about the automation, kind of the advanced and analytics, and the AI side of things. we know that we need to, and me personally within that, need to be, aware of what's coming down the pipe, and what the state of play is today, and what good looks like within these different organizations, so that we can help and advise our clients in the best way that we can.
Yeah, no, definitely. Obviously, like we've spoken a little bit about sort of the role that you've now sort of moved into. What does sort of things look like beyond that for you now?
That's a good question. I think I always love, working with clients, and I continue to do that, right? Even when I'm in this role and thinking a lot more about our firm as a whole. I continue to work with clients. I think interesting client problems is something that I'm never going to move too far away from. I think I want to help them to transform and have technology as kind of a big component of that. So it's hard to know a little bit around the long-term future, but I think helping businesses to transform with kind of technology is always going to be part of what I do.
Yeah. And do you, obviously don't want to say pull you away from PwC, and you don't have to sort of give too much away on this front, but I know, sort of like I alluded to maybe earlier a little bit, is I know a lot of people who have, say, gone down the route that you have, talk about being that sort of CTO, head of technology within sort of a business sort of in the future. Do you, is that sort of a route you see for yourself, or you enjoy sort of being part of, say, somebody such as PwC, where you can sort of touch multiple different clients at any one time, and also sort of obviously have access to loads of other sort of resources and individuals across a number of different technologies to continue to learn?
Yeah, I think you probably touched on some of the areas that excite me about working at PwC, which is the breadth and scale of a lot of the clients that we work with. So it can obviously be in a number of different industries and really large scale businesses with tough, big, hairy problems. As well as, like you said, being able to draw on deep experts in particular areas. I think earlier in my career, what I probably would have done when posed with a challenge that I wasn't an expert in, I would have just read everything I could and tried to become an expert as quickly as possible. And obviously I'm still kind of always learning, but in somewhere like PwC, I have the ability to draw on people that have been doing it for years, that are experts, that have got the war wounds from having kind of dealt with those types of problems previously. And I think talking to interesting clients about those tough questions, and again thinking about what we're doing as a firm and we're kind of approaching, and how we can deliver the best outcomes for our clients, I think is what keeps me interested and engaged. And I'd worry about moving to another firm that I would be talking about easier problems to solve as such.
Yeah, no, got you. Cool. I think that pretty much covers sort of everything that we'd planned. I'm conscious that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're jumping on another flight in a few hours, or potentially rushing to the airport. So I won't take up any more of your time, Guy. But thanks very much for joining us and being the second guest on the Blazing a Trail podcast. Some really interesting insights, not only around that sort of CTA journey, but also what things look like beyond that as well. So thanks very much again for joining, Guy. This episode will be live via various streams. I hope everyone enjoys the content, and we'll be back soon again with another episode of the Blazing a Trail podcast.